Hello everyone and welcome to this Gidea Park study day. Amid the multiple tragedies of COVID-19, I think we're beginning to realize that there are also huge opportunities. There's an added incentive to try to do something about creation, about caring and protecting the good world that God has given to us. And there's also the challenge, clearer now than ever before, to foster solidarity. And these two themes particularly have emerged as the focus of the papal teaching of Pope Francis, through his encyclicals, through his homilies, through his speeches, through his visits. We had the pleasure of welcoming Austen Ivereigh to a study day at the end of January, where he spoke about the book Let Us Dream. And today he's agreed to come back again and to focus on what is called the culture of encounter. Now, that's a phrase which is actually there in the writings of Pope Francis, the culture of encounter. And it seems to me that's about people coming together, getting to know each other, getting to respect each other beyond all the differences. And when we hear the news, when we look at what's going on in the world today, we realize how urgent this is. The specific question that Austen's going to address is, can Pope Francis' vision of fraternity counter the politicization of faith? Quite a question. So I'm delighted, Austen, once more that you're here for us and you're going to give us, I'm sure, a most interesting day. Austen is, of course, for those who don't know, a biographer of Pope Francis with his two works, The Great Reformer and The Wounded Shepherd. So Austen, I will hand over to you, welcome you, and thank you so much. We look forward very much to listening to the culture of encounter. Thank you.
Thank you, Father Adrian. It's great to be back at Gidea Park virtually, and great that you could all come this morning. I know it's a wet and cold day, which always makes it easier to accept these Zoom invitations. So I'm going to dig into this key idea of Francis's, the one that's been present from the beginning of his pontificate, and as I'll explain, goes back some way back into his life. This concept of the culture of encounter, cultura del encuentro in Spanish. It's a phrase that he first used in 1999, but as I'll explain, the origins of it really go back to his childhood. Now I'm going to do this talk in two parts, as you've just been told. In the first part, I'm going to talk about the origins of the idea, where it comes from, and really what it means, what it consists of, and how it developed over time in Aparecida, how it appears particularly in Evangelii Gaudium, his apostolic exhortation of 2013. And then I'm going to move into the great visit to Abu Dhabi in February 2019, and the human fraternity document, which of course is then quoted in extenso in Fratelli Tutti, and then March this year, the visit to Iraq. So I might not get to all of that in the first part, but what I wanted to do was to outline the concept and then show how he's applying it at the moment in a way to forestall, as you heard Father Adrian say, to forestall the unhealthy, if you like, dynamic in which religion is being exploited both by extremists and by populists. And to counter that, Francis is seeking to create a culture of encounter, which is what enables fraternity. And so that's the big sort of strategic idea that I want to explain in the first part. And in the second part, I want to dig in quite deeply into chapter 2 and 3 of Fratelli Tutti, his encyclical of October last year. And particularly what I think is the idea at the heart of it, which is the shift of consciousness, which is enabled by, or told by, or performed by, the theologians would say, the parable of the Good Samaritan. And then I want to end then with talking about synodality, and particularly in livestream, and how Francis understands that even with difference and contrast and tension, we can create something new out of that with the help of the Holy Spirit, if we have certain attitudes, which of course are very much linked to attitudes of faith. So that's a map of the two talks, but I'll probably go all over the place in my usual way. But that's to give you a little map at the beginning. So as I say, the concept was first coined. He first used the phrase "la cultura del encuentro" in 1999. So he became Archbishop of Buenos Aires in 1998. So it was just shortly after that. And he gave his first, what was called Te Deum, in Buenos Aires Cathedral. I'm just having a quick look at the time to make sure I'm going to speak for 40 minutes. Te Deum in Buenos Aires Cathedral, which is when you sort of have in Argentina an annual meeting effectively with the political leaders, the political class of the country. And when the Archbishop of Buenos Aires would traditionally give a great sort of encomium to the nation. Well, Cardinal Bergoglio used to use this as a moment really to challenge the political class. And what concerns him in that very first Te Deum that he gives is the fragmentation of Argentine society, the way people are descending in a way which we would very much recognize now as being true of the whole of Western society. People were retreating into walls of identity, withdrawing from each other into a sort of tribalism, in which I have my truth, you have your truth, I have my identity, you have yours. And everything becomes then a source of conflict and effectively a power play. Who can win? Who will win out? And he's seen this happening in Argentina. I mean, he's often said that Argentina's the kind of great besetting sin of Argentina is the history of desencuentro. And that is a great thing in Spanish, is that you've got this word encounter, encuentro, and you've also got the opposite in Spanish, desencuentro, which you can't do in English. You can't say disencounter. But it's actually a very powerful word, because people will often say in Argentina, talking about a meeting with somebody, it was a disencounter. I think we would say in English, we were like ships passing in the night. And I thought actually it's an interesting kind of almost way to begin to say, well, before we talk about what an encounter is, let's just try and imagine what a disencounter is. And I'm sure you're familiar with it. If you've ever been with somebody, or you've had a meeting with somebody, or you met somebody at a party, and it's almost as if they're looking straight past you, beyond you. They're not interested in you, or it's a purely transactional encounter in which you have to agree something, and that's it. There's no space made for each other. There's no time made for each other. There's no growth. There's no growth in understanding. Neither, as it were, reaches out to the other. Neither creates space for the other. There's no growth that takes place. So that's a desencuentro, which really helps us to understand what an encuentro is, what an encounter is, which is really the opposite of that. It is the going out to the other. There's an element there of giving up something, and of taking on something, of entering into another's space. And that requires patience, it requires time, and so on. So I'm going to talk a little bit about this. I'm going to dig a bit more into this idea of encounter in some of his writings and teachings. But just for you to understand at the beginning, you have this concept of encounter, which I'll go into in a minute. And then the culture of encounter is the application of this principle at the level of society or culture, or the level of a nation, or indeed the level of the globe, as he would now be concerned with as Pope. So we have the personal encounter, and then we have the culture of encounter, which is, if you like, is what facilitates encounter at a deeper or wider level. So the origin of this, of his, I suppose, interest in or passion for this topic goes back to his childhood. When I was doing my second book on Francis Wounded Shepherd, I was fascinated by a letter which was sort of discovered, or read out rather, in 2014 by a Brazilian priest, who later, by the way, became an official in the Vatican, but that doesn't really matter. His name is Father Alexandre Aui. And Aui acted as Bergoglio's sort of guide and interpreter in Rio de Janeiro in that first visit he made as Pope to Rio. And he had known Aui from before. Anyway, the two of them had developed a friendship. And Francis wrote him a very touching letter about his childhood, which Aui made public. I remember asking Aui about it, and he said, I just mentioned it, I never expected it to end up on a YouTube video, because it was actually a very personal letter. But what it revealed, and as his biographer, I found this fascinating, because I had this image, which was true, of Bergoglio being brought up in actually a very happy, stable, very loving family, but actually that was true of his parents and his paternal grandparents. But on his mother's side, it was actually very different. And they used to go and visit these Italian. It was a very Italian family, but the mother's side of the family was Genoese, and apparently, I don't know Italy, however, Genoese are famous for their hot tempers. And the Bergoglio family used to go and visit the mother's family, and there'd be these spectacular rows, where people throwing plates, and you can imagine the scene, a sort of violent Italian rows. And Jorge Mario Bergoglio was he was a very sensitive, very big-hearted child who I think had only known warmth and protection. He was deeply traumatized by this. And he spoke in this letter of the impact that it had on him, and how he wanted to just go away and hide. He was really terrified by all of this. And he said in the letter to Aui, he said, I think this could be the origin of my interest in the culture of encounter. And what he meant by that was, in other words, how can we not just avoid arguments? That's far too superficial an idea. The idea of the culture of encounter is how we can depolarize, how we can take tensions and depolarize them and allow then something to live with the tension and disagreement in such a way that we find a more fruitful way to live together. Indeed, we transcend not just our differences, but we are able to go on to a new way of thinking. And this is the way that differences can be contained and made fruitful, is what he came to talk about as and this isn't his phrase, by the way, as a reconciled diversity. Now, culture of encounter in many ways is Francis's or Bergoglio's own reformulation of the theological idea of a reconciled diversity, where people retain what is important to them, what is true to them. There's no denial, there's no giving up of anything, but as it were, they choose not to cling to it, and they enter into a relationship with others, which then can produce something greater. Now, this became Francis Bergoglio's passion intellectually. He was, and when we get on to synodality, I'll come back to this, talk about his thesis, but he effectively did his doctoral thesis, as you know, if you've read my books, on Romano Guardini's understanding of contraposition and contrast. And so this was the sort of intellectual expression of this idea that I've just expressed about how we can hold together divisions and disagreements in such a way as to allow them to become fruitful. And I think all of this can be therefore rooted or traced back to that childhood family experience, as Francis put it in this letter to Father Aui, which created in my heart a desire for people not to fight to stay united, or if they do fight, to remain friends. As this idea has developed in his life, I think he himself has come to understand that the capacity for encounter is in many ways the key characteristic of the Christian, of the person of faith. Yes, that it begins, and here's the sort of theology of it, that it begins with a personal encounter with Jesus. Our faith has to begin, even if we've inherited it from childhood, or we've come at faith in an intellectual way or whatever. At some point, there has to be, for faith to be real, there has to be a personal encounter with Jesus, which must touch the heart, which must create a new space within us, which must, to some way, change our horizon. So we are talking here about a God of encounter. We are talking here about a God who makes himself known to us, or makes God's self known to us in encounter, in personal encounter, and not just an encounter sort of with me as an individual, but entering also into my space, my culture, my people. So we have a God of the incarnation who, to save the world, to show the world, to show humanity the dignity of their own, what it means to be created by God, the dignity that comes with that, actually becomes incarnate in a place, in a time, speaking a language. Jesus is fully a part of that Jewish culture of the time. So we're talking here about a very rich idea of encounter, not just flying in, saying hi, and going away again, but entering completely and utterly into that space, into that culture, and of course being willing to die for those people, which is what Jesus did. So our whole faith begins with the concept, with the understanding of encounter, and that this entering into our culture, our way of thinking, our mode of being, has this element of kenosis, to use a big theological word, that there's a renunciation involved. The famous St. Paul thing. He took on the condition of a slave. He did not cling to God, but took on the condition of a slave. There's a renunciation, and to some extent in all encounter there has to be an element of renunciation. We must choose to renounce something, whether it's our pride or our desire to flee, or our horror of listening to other people's pain, or whatever it is. There's an element of kenosis, and to use another Greek word of synktakabasis, of coming down to come close. Now that's obviously what God performs. God performs this action of coming down in order to come close. But the closeness is absolutely key. There can be no encounter without proximity. And therefore for the church, and this is why this is such an important idea for Francis's whole pontificate, is that the church, we as Christians, the church as a whole, we have to be close. We have to learn how to make ourselves close, to make ourselves neighbors to others, in order to communicate the nature of God. Now, the key, and Francis says somewhere, I forget where, sorry, Jesus never proselytized. Jesus did not proselytize. He accompanied. Jesus made known God by walking with people, by getting to know them, by entering into dialogue with them, by responding to them in freedom and in their freedom. Now, the key to all of this is proximity, but then the other key is dialogue. So that dialogue is what enables encounter. Dialogue is not just speaking, of course. Dialogue is entering into communication with, and of course a very large part of dialogue is the capacity to listen. Listening as a key element of dialogue. And indeed one might say, and this is relevant now with Israel and Palestinians, going hell to leather at each other again at the moment. What is war? What is war except the absence of dialogue? The absence of dialogue, of course, doesn't necessarily produce war, but it produces the conditions for war. And war is very definitely the absence of dialogue. Now, in the meeting of Aparecida in Brazil in May 2007, which is when the Latin American bishops gathered together for a historic meeting, which I've often talked about in my books as the basis in many ways of this pontificate, the concept of encounter becomes absolutely key. So the Latin American bishops get together and they kind of analyze modernity, and they ask themselves some very big questions, like why is it the church has such difficulty in evangelizing the contemporary world? And they come up with not just simply a sociological analysis, but a kind of an understanding of what they call the change of era. The way technology and the digital era is changing the way we live, is undermining our institutions, producing this society which has been famously called a liquid society of transition and so on. All of which, of course, makes encounter much harder, but conversely produces in contemporary humanity a yearning for, or a thirst for, to use the language of the document, encounter. So we have this paradox that we live in an age of disencounter, of fragmentation, of dissolution of the bonds of belonging, where it is harder to have bonds of trust and belonging, where faith is no longer transmitted through those bonds of community and culture and law. Of course it is to some extent, but to a far lesser extent than it was. And we have this hunger, which you see particularly among the young, but really among everybody today, the yearning to belong, to have that encounter. So this was the great analysis of Aparecida. And what Aparecida really keeps talking about many times is what they call the primary encounter, el encuentro founding encounter, encuentro fundante, which is the kind of the amazement of the disciples in meeting Jesus, the exceptional quality of the one who was speaking to them, how he treated them. I'm quoting here from the document, satisfying the hunger and thirst for life that was in their hearts. So Aparecida says that we can no longer rely on Catholic institutions and culture to transmit the faith. We have to, as it were, go back, if it is a going back, or to recover the original Christian way of proclamation, which was people who had had that encounter with Christ went out to proclaim it and talk about it and put it into practice. And they didn't have the support of big institutions or law and culture. We're talking here about, of course, the first centuries of the church, when indeed there was persecution. And yet they were able to communicate the amazement of that encounter with Christ to people, and not just in words, but also in actions, which again, people found captivating or scandalous, whoever you were. But you certainly couldn't ignore the Christians, because they had this story to tell. So this is in a sense what Aparecida is inviting the church to recover that, if it is to become again a missionary evangelizing force in the world, because part of its diagnosis of the church is that the church, particularly in the rich north, has gone cold. It has become disenchanted. It has lost that capacity, that missionary capacity, because it's clinging to its institutions, because it's clinging to the past or whatever. So the invitation is to come to enable the encounter with Christ. This is what they call in Aparecida the encuentro fundante. And Aparecida spells out all the different ways that this can happen, through the sacraments, through liturgies, through prayer, through contemplation of scripture, and so on. But it also talks very much about the encounter outside, this going out to encounter Christ in the poor, in the margins. Francis describes this, of course, in Evangelii Gaudium as the popular going out to meet Christ in the people. This spontaneous missionary activity, as he calls it, of the people of God. But so this is the big idea, the big concept of Aparecida, which is the faith encounter with the person of Jesus. It sounds very simple, almost banal, and yet actually it involves quite a big shift in the church's own thinking. And I can, by the way, anecdotally, Aparecida was a Pentecost experience, the Latin American church. They went into it feeling really quite depressed and down about, secularization and the spread of evangelicals and breakup of families, all the usual stuff. And they came away 2 weeks later really fired up by this vision, by this understanding, which they saw very much as a fruit of the Spirit. And it's this vision that underpins the whole Francis pontificate, and I believe will also underpin future pontificates. Aparecida is the most compelling vision of anywhere of the church at the moment. Now, if we look at Evangelii Gaudium, which is really the re-expression of Aparecida for the universal church by Pope Francis, it's his, if you like, foundational document, and we have encounter again mentioned something like 34 times in the document. Many, of course, right at the start, the very first line of Evangelii Gaudium, the joy of the gospel fills the hearts and lives of all who encounter Jesus. And just in those first few paragraphs, paragraph 3, I invite all Christians everywhere at this very moment to a renewed personal encounter with Jesus Christ, or at least an openness to letting him encounter them. In other words, go out to meet Christ, and if you can't do that, open your heart to allow him to come to you. And to do it each day. And he quotes, Francis quotes in Evangelii Gaudium, as he had done also, by the way, in Aparecida, quotes Benedict XVI, which he says, this phrase takes us to the heart of the gospel. Being a Christian is not the result of an ethical choice or a lofty idea, but the encounter with an event, a person, which gives life a new horizon and a decisive direction. So the Christian faith is born from this encounter which changes our horizon. Paragraph 75, interesting contrast Francis draws between talking about the way we live now, that in our cities and so on, the degradation of our environment, so that what could be significant places of encounter and solidarity often become places of isolation and mutual distrust. So you were setting up here an interesting opposition, aren't we, between encounter and solidarity, fraternity, if you like, and isolation, mutual distrust. And above all, I would direct you to paragraphs 87 and 88, where we have, again, this very typical of Aparecida analysis of how we have networks and media and the social media and so on, which have enabled us to have contact, but often not fraternity. So there's a chaos in all of this, which they see as the potential to be converted into networks of fraternity. So this is a great challenge of the modern age, that we have a greater contact with each other through social media, and yet we have less fraternity. That paradox, if you like, is what needs to be converted. To use the actual phrase of Evangelii Gaudium, greater possibilities for communication thus turn into greater possibilities for encounter and solidarity for everyone. But how do we do that? How do we learn to do that is the great challenge of the culture of encounter. Paragraph 171 talks, as I've already mentioned, about the art of listening, which is absolutely key to the culture of encounter. Listening in communication is an openness of the heart which makes possible that closeness without which genuine spiritual encounter cannot occur. Very important phrase, that. Yeah? We cannot have encounter unless we open our heart, and listening is what opens the heart. By listening with an open heart is how we enable the dialogue to take place. Only through such respectful and compassionate listening can we enter our paths of true growth and awaken a yearning for the Christian ideal, the desire to respond fully to God's love and to bring to fruition what he has sown in our lives. And the other paragraph to draw attention to is paragraph 220, which is part of that section in Evangelii Gaudium about building a people. So paragraph 220, people in every nation enhance the social dimension of their lives by acting as committed and responsible citizens, not as a mob swayed by the powers that be. And then he goes on to talk about, yet becoming a people demands something more. It is an ongoing process in which every new generation must take part, a slow and arduous effort, calling for a desire for integration and a willingness to achieve this through the growth of a peaceful and multifaceted culture of encounter. So this is the expression for the Universal Church of what really he was working on as Archbishop of Buenos Aires in helping Argentina in those Te Deums every year to embrace a new kind of culture to overcome the desencuentro, the fragmentation, the disencounter, which so characterized particularly the politics and the society of that country, but which of course is very much part of what we are all living with. So as Pope, he has really been teaching that paragraph 220 in his apostolic visits. So he often in his apostolic visits, particularly to Latin America, has meetings with civic leaders. And you will usually find in those meetings on his apostolic trips, when he's talking, by the way, not just to believers, but you might be talking to anybody, civic leaders in general, trade unionists or mayors, but he gathers them in a room and he talks to them about the polyhedron, about the reconciled diversity, about the culture of encounter, and he sort of gives them tips and techniques about that. So there's a lot to unpack in those speeches about that, but that is the key idea. And what he is doing as Pope is very interesting, is he's modeling for the rest of the church the role of us as Christians as to use a Latin phrase, a complexio oppositorum, a reconciler of opposites, a carrier of tensions. Key idea for Francis. This is actually what Christ does, what God does. It enters the world and takes the difference, the tension, and turns it into something new. So this is the role of a very important role. So we talk about the Pope as Pontifex Maximus, the great builder of bridges. Building bridges is a holy act. Reconciliation, build bridges between people to enable encounter so that something new can be born, is a key task of the Church, of the Pope, and indeed of all of us as missionary disciples of Christ. So now let's go to the fraternity document. So the fraternity document, or the document on human fraternity, which was signed in February 2019 by Pope Francis and Sheikh Al-Tayeb, who's a kind of, I suppose, the chief jurist of the Sunni Muslim world. And they signed this document in Abu Dhabi, and they had a big meeting with interreligious meeting. It was a key moment in this pontificate and in this bridge building exercise, which was actually long prepared. And I knew at the time, I was told that it had been something like 2 years in the preparation, but I really didn't know too much about it. But just recently, there's been a book published, which is mentioned, if you're interested, there's an article about the book by Jerry O'Connell, at American Magazine. And it's really a very interesting article. And in that book, which is a book by, so I'm just looking for it now. I had it up here on the screen, just lost it. Yes, here it is. Just let me find it for a moment. Just a moment. So look, yeah. So yes, the article is called, if you're interested, An Inside Look at How Pope Francis and the Grand Imam of Al-Azhar Have Revolutionized Catholic-Muslim Relations. Rather long title. It was published on April the 13th, 2021. Anyway, this book, which is called The Pope and the Grand Imam, A Thorny Path, written in fact by the counselor to Al-Tayeb. Very interesting account, how this came about. And without giving a whole history of it, what you see is there's this contact between this, he's not the Pope, but he's the major religious figure of the Sunni Muslim world, who sees Pope Francis, sees what he's doing, his outreach to migrants, but particularly the way Francis, remember, this is back in 2015, 2016, when we had all those jihadist attacks, and Francis always refuses to equate Islam and terrorism. He says Islam and terrorism are two different things here. We all have our fundamentalists and our extremists, though. That's not real Islam. Deeply impressed Sheikh Al-Tayeb. Anyway, there's this sort of various, they're reaching out to each other, and then there's a meeting between them finally, and then another meeting in 2017 where they had lunch, and they sort of just agreed they said, we need to work together for humanity and peace. And apparently the Pope picked up a piece of bread and cut it into two halves. He took one half himself and gave the other half to the Grand Imam, and each of them, ate his share of the bread in what this council describes as a symbolic act of coexistence and human fraternity. It's a nice little touch. Kind of Eucharistic as well, right? I mean, a great anecdote. Anyway, during that 2.5-hour lunch, the judge proposes, this is the councillor, that the Pope and the Grand Imam effectively build on the success of their early initiatives with this document on human fraternity, that they would both sign it and they would present it. And anyway, that's where the idea was born. 2017, took about 2 years. 2019, we had this document launched called the Document on Human Fraternity. And if you haven't read it, it's worth reading. It's actually a document which is not, it's far more than just a set of banal, propositions of lowest common denominators. It's really quite a radical document. I think it's very challenging for both sides. It's called the Document on Human Fraternity for World Peace and Living Together. And it begins in the name of God, who has created all human beings equal in rights, duties, and dignity, and who has called them to live together as brothers and sisters, to fill the earth and to make known the values of goodness and love and peace and so on. So it's starting with this very bold proclamation of faith in God. They don't get into the theological differences, but they say, God has forbidden to kill. They say, God asks us to live together as brothers and sisters. they call upon everybody to rediscover the values of peace, of justice, of goodness, of beauty, of human fraternity, and so on. Effectively, what they do is they not only just affirm those things, but they together condemn the instrumentalization of religion by both fanatics and by populists. And just to briefly explain this, Francis, it's clear from my reading of a lot of his speeches back in particularly 2018, 2019, you can see that Francis is deeply concerned by the emergence across the Western world of the forces of populism, which are often coming to power or gaining popularity by scapegoating Muslims. This, I mean, in the Christian West, you know, whether it's raising the walls to keep out immigration, or whether it's laws to deny people citizenship and so on. There's these crowd-pleasing initiatives by populists who are clearly putting the blame for contemporary ills on this kind of foreign element, on Muslims, and promising, in a sense, to build a wall. I mean, in Trump's case, literally to build a wall around them to protect them from this, and to shun the foreigners on. And by the way, quite understandable as a political move, given that people are deeply traumatized by the jihadi attacks that, as we know, went right into our cities and killed huge numbers of our people, of our citizens. And so quite understandable that there should be this fear. But the populists play on this, and they want to scapegoat the whole of Islam. And so what Francis and Al-Tayeb are doing here is they're condemning both of those things. They're condemning the extremism which practices violence in the name of God. And also they condemn the populism which pretends to be protecting religion by scapegoating or blaming or opposing the other religion. So it's this cycle, this dynamic, that they're seeking to break through, or break out of, I should say, in this, by standing together and saying, here we are, Pope, Grand Imam, this is what we believe. And by the way, this thing over here is not religion. This is not us. This is not Islam. This is not Christianity. That is a false god. That is an ideology. So that's the strategy. And of course, it involved a lot of thinking also about how each faith could affirm the other or affirm the other's needs. So we have, for example, Al-Tayeb, saying that Christians have a right, to freedom of worship, which is quite a big deal in the Arab world to say that. And in fact, they had the first mass ever on the Arabian Peninsula in Abu Dhabi. The Pope celebrated mass there first time. So there's clearly some gain, and equally, the Pope is affirming the need to welcome migrants, to respect them, to respect their differences, and so on. But I think so that's the strategy behind the document. But I think the lasting impact of it is in its call on all people of faith to work together, to create a society of fraternities. There's a very important idea that because we have different faiths, that somehow we can't work together. Francis and Al-Tayeb are saying, no. Look at all that we believed. Look at the faith that we have. Look at the God we believe in. We need to work together. So it lays out the basis for a civic movement inspired by faith that can help to build a culture of encounter, a culture of fraternity in our world. And then, of course, the coda to this is the visit to Iraq, which Pope Francis made in March, where he met the leader. Again, none of these are official, but the sort of acknowledged leader of the Shiite Islam, Shiite Muslims, al-Sistani, and it was a remarkable meeting, which again took many months of preparation. The al-Sistani, a 90-year-old cleric revered across the Shiite world, they had this lovely meeting, and afterwards had a message which, Sistani affirmed his concern that Christian citizens should live like all Iraqis in peace and security with full constitutional rights. In other words, a complete rejection of the extremists. Francis thanks Sistani for raising his voice in defense of the weakest and the most persecuted. So again, they're affirming together the vitality and the importance of fraternity. After meeting al-Sistani, the Pope then goes to attend a gathering in Ur, which is the famous Ur, the birthplace of Abraham. Abraham, of course, the prophet revered by all three monotheisms. And so, again, very symbolic meeting, 6,000-year-old ziggurat, you know, in the plains of Ur, traditional birthplace of Abraham. And there, the various religious leaders, although sadly missing Jews, gathered together and issued a very important statement. And Francis, again, does an address there, which is really a summary of the culture of encounter. So to try and answer Father Adrian's question, is this all capable of breaking that link between, on the one hand, that sort of diabolic mutual dependence of, on the one hand, religious extremism, Islamic extremism, on the other hand, national populism? Short answer is I don't know, but because history is very hard to predict. But I think it's been one of the most significant and courageous acts by religious leaders, really for certainly in my lifetime, and perhaps in many, many hundreds of years. And the effect of it, I think, will be with us for a long time. So this second session will hopefully be a bit gentler and a bit deeper too. I want to go into what I think is some of the really sort of deep ideas involved in this concept of the culture of encounter. And I want to talk firstly about Fratelli Tutti. So we've just been talking about the document on human fraternity, and indeed the declaration with Al-Sistani. And of course, both of them, in a sense, are very much belong with Fratelli Tutti. There's a triptych here. We've got Fratelli Tutti in the middle. We've got the two encounters with the Muslim leaders. And Fratelli Tutti, if you've read it, of course, begins with the document on human fraternity and ends with it. So it's framed by that. And Francis himself, talking, by the way, about his meeting with Al-Sistani, he on the plane on the way back from Iraq, he said that the meeting with the Ayatollah in Iraq could be described as a sort of second step, with the first one being that meeting with Al-Tayeb. And he says, you know, these are vital on the path to fraternity, but there will be others. You know, in other words, he sees this as a process of building. And he says, the Abu Dhabi document left in me a restlessness for fraternity. And then Fratelli Tutti was published, he said, but noting that both documents go in the same direction. So Fratelli Tutti is an encyclical, like Laudato Si, his second encyclical. But really, I was saying at the time when I was asked about it that I think Fratelli Tutti forms part of sorry to introduce another triptych, but a triptych of teachings of this pontificate. The first of which is Evangelii Gaudium. So even though Evangelii Gaudium of 2013 is a apostolic exhortation, in other words, it's technically a response to the Synod on the New Evangelization of 2012, it's not therefore an encyclical, but actually it reads like an encyclical. It's as big as an encyclical, and it has the kind of the weight of thought and understanding of an encyclical. And so if we think of Evangelii Gaudium as the first of this triptych, Laudato Si as the second, and Fratelli Tutti as the third, what we have here is a triptych of teachings that are concerned with restoring or regenerating the three vital relationships of our existence. Evangelii Gaudium is concerned with our relationship with our Creator, and the Church, you know, that flows from that relationship with our Creator. And then Laudato Si is concerned with our relationship with creation, with the created world, with our fellow non-human creatures. And Fratelli Tutti is concerned with our relationship with our fellow human creatures. So there's a sort of link between the three here that I think in many ways this will be the great triptych of teachings of his pontificate, which isn't to take away from some of the other documents, but I think they have the kind of the length, the depth, and the big ideas of the encyclical the backbone of teaching of this pontificate of the Francis era. Now, Fratelli Tutti is concerned with social friendship. So it's this important phrase, which we don't really have in English, but it's concerned with friendship at the level of society. So again, it's the culture of encounter at the level of society. And it starts, and it's against the backdrop of something we almost don't need to be told, which is that the world is fast losing its sense of the oneness of the human family. So there's the erosion of the notion of the common good. There's an erosion, degeneration of what would traditionally be called civic dialogue. In other words, the way we interact at the level of society with each other, the way institutions and groups interact with each other of different political parties, political movements, and so on. The way we create this public space of dialogue, widely commented on, has degenerated. It's become much more of a slanging match. It's become much more of a power game. Who can win? Who can dominate the discussion? Who can create the narrative that dominates? To use some of the phrases of now. And of course, although he doesn't use the phrase, but cancel culture, as it's become known, this idea that you don't have the right to open your mouth because you're white and middle class, or you're this or you're that. No, I can't talk to you because I cancel you. All this ghastly attempt, I think, to somehow cancel the past by pulling down statues, rather than debating the past, owning up to the shame of the past and everything that these statues of people and their dubious backgrounds. Rather than discuss them, we pull them down and we replace them by people nobody's ever heard of, because that makes us feel better. So there's a crisis of modernity, there's a crisis of dialogue, that and humanity descending into this darkness of civic strife, of conflict, of tribalism and nationalism. And this is, in Francis's analysis, partly the symptom of the outgrowth of what one might call a lopsided modernity. So if you take the three great slogans, phrases of the French Revolution, liberté, égalité, fraternité, in reality, liberté and égalité have dominated the last 200 or 300 years. One might say liberty was the great thing of the 19th century. Equality has been the great slogan of the 20th century. Fraternity sort of drops out of the picture very, very quickly, and so fraternity has been ignored or downgraded. And yet, of course, without fraternity, liberty descends into permissiveness and avarice. It becomes a license for the powerful to possess and to exploit. And then you get equality. Equality without fraternity, equality fails to respect legitimate difference and diversity. So we have this, equality becomes a drive for uniformity. And classically in political programs like socialism, where it's a leveling down or a leveling of everybody to the same, so that there's a sort of, humanity becomes an abstraction which then needs to be imposed on people without respect for their personal cultures and freedoms and so on. So we have a lopsided modernity, obsessed with liberty and equality, failing to grasp the implications of fraternity and to embrace the limits that fraternity would demand. So Francis is starting Fratelli Tutti with this understanding that only by restoring a proper sense of the worth of every person and a recognition of his or her dignity, which of course in faith is what we learn through the encounter with the loving God. Only by recovering that sense of worth can we refound or regenerate our social life. So unless, I'm quoting here now from Francis 107, unless this basic principle is upheld, there will be no future, either for fraternity or for the survival of humanity. Francis sees this in really quite apocalyptic terms. Yeah, it's a question of survival. We either work this out or we perish. And these are particularly the observations, by the way, in the third chapter, which is called Envisaging and Engendering an Open World. The whole thing begins, the first chapter, which is really quite grim reading, is called Dark Clouds Over a Closed World. While the second chapter, A Stranger on the Road, is his famous exegesis of the Good Samaritan. So actually, if we take those three headings, you can sort of see there's a pattern of conversion. So moving from a fearful, isolated, clinging to identity and tribe to another kind of humanity, to a broader and deeper understanding of humanity, in which compassion for the needs of all living beings, the foreigner, the stranger, the outsider, becomes actually a new kind of identity. So we have a humanity, as it were, a new people is born out of the experience of fraternity and solidarity. Francis says in paragraph 70, now there are only two kinds of people, those who care for someone who is hurting and those who pass by on the other side, those who bend down to help and those who look the other way and hurry off. Now, he's very clear that being religious, belonging to a religion, being a Catholic or a Jew or whatever, it ain't going to save us from that same choice. Because, of course, the parable of the Good Samaritan, it's who are the two that pass by on the other side? They're both religious figures, the priest and the Levite. And this fact, Francis says, this shows that belief in God and the worship of God are not enough to ensure that we are actually living in a way that is pleasing to God. Ooh. Paradoxically, those who claim to be unbelievers can sometimes put God's will into practice better than believers. Again, ouch. But of course, illustrated brilliantly and constantly by the Gospels. Now, towards the end of chapter 2, Francis sort of applies the screws again. He says, given what believers come to understand through the words and presence of Christ in the poorest and neediest, Matthew chapter 25. So what do we learn through that? We learn that God loves every man and woman with infinite love, and therefore confers dignity upon them, whether they know it or not. They have that dignity, whether or not they're aware of it. And then Francis says, I sometimes wonder why, given that, it took so long for the church unequivocally to condemn slavery and various forms of violence. So there's no let out here. For being religious and being fraternal do not flow automatically. It's not enough. And today he says there can be no excuses, of course, for those things. Yet there are Christians, he says, who justify violent nationalism, xenophobia, and contempt, a fact that he says should prompt preachers and catechists to speak more directly and clearly about our reasons for loving and accepting all our brothers and sisters. And if we needed an illustration of that, surely the events of January the 6th and the storming of the Capitol in the United States, which involved, of course, a white supremacist movement supported by rad, trad Catholics, as they become known. It's just a dramatic illustration of that. We have contempt and racism and all that, right in the heart of our church. And Francis is alerting us to this and saying, we need to be part of it. If we're not at the forefront of building this culture of encounter and fraternity, well, who's going to do it for us? So there's a clear call on the preachers and catechists, people of influence in the church, to stand up and denounce what impedes or prevents fraternity. Attitudes, in other words, incompatible with the awareness of the shared dignity of all that comes from the encounter with Christ. Chapter 3 then fleshes out the implications of this, what we might call this hermeneutic shift, which expresses itself in self-transcendence. So, sorry to use these complex words, but the hermeneutic shift is the shift of awareness or the shift in understanding, the way we now view the world, the horizon of our vision is changed by this ability or capacity to transcend ourselves, which is at the heart of the culture of encounter. This capacity for self-transcendence, which we were talking about earlier, the capacity for encounter, is ultimately the measure of a person's spiritual stature, the capacity for encounter. Can we enable encounter? Can we transcend ourselves enough? Now, I'm going to come back to this idea of self in a minute, but are we capable of that self-transcendence, which is what facilitates or enables encounter? Having, as it were, said that, Francis then says, yet some believers think that it consists of the imposition of their own ideologies upon everyone else, or in violent defense of the truth, or in impressive demonstrations of strength. So again, Francis is a master at presenting us with the choice. You can do this or you can do that. And this is what you're invited to. And by the way, this is what it looks like if you don't do it. we have the invitation to self-transcendence and fraternity. And on the other hand, we have, and we can all immediately think of people that we know who are like this, who say, you know, we've got the truth and I'm going to shout louder and I'm going to convince you of my point of view. And I'm going to, you know, when we all have this ideology or this view or this idea of 1950s Catholicism, you know, enshrined in the state of the law, yeah, that basically those are all power games. Yeah? They're all about imposing. They're all about using power and force. And as long as we have that, as long as we have that attitude, which is, whether it's a mild or an extreme form of fundamentalism, then we are incapable of creating fraternity. And that, of course, applies to religious people, and it applies to non-religious people. And some of the most, of course, fanatical, ideological people we all know are indeed not religious at all. Now, fraternal love, what is it? So he defines fraternal love as action directed towards others, considering them of value, apart from their physical or moral appearances. I suspect that's probably not a very good translation, but what he's saying is, you know, they're valuable whatever they look like, you know, or whether they're disabled, or whether they're, you know, beautiful or ugly or repellent or this. Yeah, there is an inherent dignity there. They are of value. They have value. So this is the love, he says, when cultivated, that makes possible social friendship. Now, again, we're talking here about social friendship rather than individual friendship. He's not talking about how we all need to become literally friends, because actually, somebody once said to me, you know, you can't actually have good friends on, I think this person said, more than two hands. You know, yeah, if you've got 10 good friends in this world, you're lucky. I mean, people you can phone up at any time and, you know, shoot the breeze with and so on. We're not talking about that kind of friendship. We're talking about social friendship, which is this ability to come close and embrace and respect as being of value, people who are in need. So every brother or sister in need, when abandoned or ignored by the society in which I live, becomes an existential foreigner, even though born in the same country. So social friendship understands that people need to belong, and that they do not belong, they become part of a culture, a throwaway culture, to the extent that they have been abandoned or ignored by the society in which they live. And of course, that might be, you know, because they're an undocumented migrant, it might be because they're poor, it might be whatever, for whatever reason. So this idea of an existential foreigner. So true social friendship is creates a true universal openness. A true universal openness, as opposed to the false universalism of those who constantly travel abroad because they cannot tolerate or love their own people. I think this is a great line, and it reminds me very much of the book, is it called The Anywhere People, Somewhere Anywhere? But anyway, which divides the world into somewhere or anywhere. You know, if you're a kind of educated, upwardly mobile, global citizen, yeah, you do very well out of contemporary modernity, because, you know, your company relocates you to Madrid and you're quite happy to go, and you can put your children in the private school there and so on. You know, you're a citizen of the world, as opposed to you know, the person who actually doesn't want to go more than 10 miles from where they were born, because they feel they belong and they know the local pub and they don't want to move. So you have this sort of contrast between the two, which of course became a very important question, didn't it, in the whole kind of Brexit debate. But what Francis is nailing here is something called a false universalism, because there are people saying, you know, I love everybody, I respect everybody, I'm, you know, everybody to me is equal. Yeah. You know, I don't discriminate. It's a bit actually like some of these corporations. You know, when you go on to buy something, you know, everybody's treated exactly the same, because as long as you've got money in your pocket, you're a consumer. You know, we respect you and we like you. We don't care who you are. That's false universalism. It's not authentic, true universal openness. That's what Francis is saying here. True universal openness is openness to those people who are beyond your horizon, who are at the edges, who are at the margins, who may be poor or lacking. And if you fail to see them, then that's not true fraternity. Now, it's at this point, so we're in the third chapter of Fratelli Tutti, that Francis touches on what I think is really the big idea of the encyclical. That's what I wanted to dig in for a moment with you, because just to cast your mind back to Laudato Si of 2015, the big idea of Laudato Si you could summarize as being an ecological conversion from the technocratic paradigm. So the big idea of Laudato Si is that the way our mindset has become technocratic, such that we view the created world as something that we can exploit and use for our own ends. So we've lost that primal relationship with the created world, which leads us to respect it and care for it. So that is the challenge of Laudato Si, is to be converted from the technocratic paradigm and to a culture of mercy and care, which is summarized by this phrase, ecological conversion. Now, in Fratelli Tutti, I don't think Francis makes a big idea as explicit as he does in Laudato Si, and I think that's arguably, by the way, I think a weakness of these six, but I think it could have been much better brought out, in my view. But nonetheless, it's a very important idea. And the key to the idea is to be found in a footnote, and I think it's number 100. Yes, that's right. Yeah. So it's the paragraph that begins really with 101, which is subtitled at the top, "Beyond a World of Associates." And this is where translations can be thinking, what on earth is an associate? And he says in this paragraph that he's talking about, again, the Good Samaritan. The Good Samaritan, so the man on the roadside, so he's contrasting the response of the priest and the Levite and the Samaritan. And he says that the people walking by the injured man did not heed their interior summons to act as neighbors, right? So they didn't heed that interior summons. They were concerned with their duties, with their social status, with their professional position within society. They considered themselves important for the society of the time. Yeah, these were important people. And they were anxious to play their proper part. The man on the roadside, bruised and abandoned, was a distraction, an interruption from all that. You know, these are busy, important people. They're on their way somewhere to do important religious tasks for the good of Israel, as God commands, you know, performing God's laws. And there's this character on the roadside, bruised and abandoned. They don't want to know. He's a distraction. He was hardly important. And then Francis says he was a nobody. He was undistinguished. He was irrelevant to their plans for the future. Now, I want to just stop there halfway through that paragraph 101, because just to be clear what Francis is talking about here, he's talking about a mindset, a mental state, or to use a bigger word, a hermeneutic. The way they are viewing themselves and the world is conditioned by their own sense of themselves as having an identity. An identity founded on their own sense of their own importance as a priest, as a leader, whatever it is. So they had a hermeneutic restriction, if you like. Their vision was conditioned by that mindset. Now, just to carry on quoting Francis, the Good Samaritan transcended these narrow classifications. He himself did not fit into any of those categories. He was simply a foreigner without a place in society. Free of every label and position, he was able to interrupt his journey, change his plans, and unexpectedly come to the aid of an injured person who needed his help. Now, again, just to pause and reflect a bit on this. The contrast that Francis is drawing here is somebody who has a hermeneutic conditioned by their own sense of themselves and their own ego. And this other person, the Samaritan, who, by the way, wasn't he had money and all the rest of it, right? I mean, he wasn't, but this Samaritan didn't have that hermeneutic. Now, you might say he didn't have it because he was an outsider and he was a foreigner. True, but the most important thing here is not who he was, but the fact that he was capable of transcending the hermeneutic, which so restricts the Levite and the Samaritan. Now, Francis then asks in a very challenging way, what would be the reaction to that same story nowadays in a world that constantly witnesses the emergence and growth of social groups clinging to an identity that separates them from others? How would it affect those who organize themselves in a way that prevents any foreign presence that might threaten their identity and their closed and self-referential structures? There, even the possibility of acting as a neighbor is excluded One is a neighbor only to those who serve their purpose. The word neighbor loses all meaning. There can only be associates, that is to say, partners in the pursuit of particular interests. So there's a very, very challenging paragraph here to say, all right, you've realized now what the Good Samaritan is about. Now, as a society, what are we doing? In other words, do we as a culture say, Britain is a very important and successful place with a sixth largest economy in the world, with a vibrant local culture, and frankly, we're not going to have it taken away or diluted by foreigners because they take away from. You see the idea of what is our hermeneutic, what is our vision, what is our mindset. Now, I said earlier that I think this idea could have been brought out better, and I think it could be because when you look at the footnote in 100 actually, the footnote is to a little essay in this book by Paul Ricoeur, Protestant theologian, French, writing back in the 60s, and the volume is called Histoire et Vérité. But the essay that's cited is called Le Socius et le Prochain, and it's footnoted there. And when this section is called Beyond a World of Associates, associate is their translation of socius, or in Spanish, socio. Okay. Now, I don't myself think associate is a very good word, but we might say colleagues, right? But the important thing to understand here is the contraposition between the idea of a colleague and the idea of a neighbor, right? One is a relationship of functionality, which we enter into for the purposes of trade and negotiation and so on, whereas the other is something much, much deeper. And this is what this essay is about. So the hermeneutic contrast here between the colleague or the associate and the neighbor. One is reduced to a static role, and the other is able to become a creature of God or a channel of God's love and mercy. So reflecting on this very same parable of the Good Samaritan, Ricoeur says that Jesus' answer to the question, who is my neighbor, is that the neighbor is not a social object, but a behavior in the first person. In other words, one does not have a neighbor. I make myself someone's neighbor. It's something that you perform if you're capable of transcending your hermeneutic, right? And to do so requires, Ricoeur says, moving out from your social role, socius, to make yourself a neighbor, le prochain. The priest and the Levite are trapped in their roles and social functions, and they are incapable of transcending. They are defined and limited by them. Whereas the Samaritan, that nobody, a despised foreigner, demonstrates this capacity for encounter and self-transcendence. Now, Ricoeur says quite interestingly, hence the shock that we see in Matthew chapter 25, when we discover, or in the Jesus' parable, the people discover that Jesus is actually in the poor who are helped and served. So it is the hidden Jesus in the poor, the one who is despised at the side of the road, that's hidden from us, because if we're locked in this in the hermeneutic of the Levite, we cannot see. Whereas with the new awareness that the Samaritan has, we, as it were, are able to unleash that insight, that poor person by the side of the road, as it were, contains God. Forgive me for not using a very theological expression. So I think it's rather a fascinating little essay here, and as I say, I think it could have been developed much more. But Ricoeur says that the Samaritan, of course, is also a category, but it's a category that is for others, a person for others. So, he's able to be for others because he does not define himself as belonging to a group. He may belong to a group, but he doesn't allow that to define him and to limit him. So that he says here, he's in the category of non-category, if you like. That's the paradox there. He's on a journey. He's ready to change his route. Literally, he's able to change the direction in which he's traveling to go and help this person. He has that disponibilité, you say in French, this availability to others. So the Samaritan is a person because of his capacity for encounter, to have compassion beyond the role, beyond the personality. And then I think, anyway, I think that's really the heart of this essay. I could say more about it, but that's the key idea of this essay. So we have that in Ricoeur's understanding, and this is where I think the encyclical could have developed this a bit, is that, I mean, France is saying that only those capable of being associates create closed worlds. Yeah. But the rest of Ricoeur's reflection is that today's world is increasingly defined by social function. Yeah. We live in an age where increasingly we understand ourselves as functional beings, you know. I don't know, I'm a writer, you're an accountant, whatever. But we understand ourselves, and particularly I think the way the market works and the way we are so much defined by the market, that we are more and more pressed into these categories, which I think our nature actually rebels at. You know, we are more than these things, but yet somehow we accept them as well. So the problem is not modernity or technology per se. It's a bit like Laudato Si. Laudato Si doesn't actually condemn modernity, it doesn't condemn technology, but it says it wants us to be aware of the risks, of the temptations, of the dangers of that mindset. And so Ricoeur is saying, look out for this tendency to objectify people within the abstract, impersonal relationships of modern life, which in turn, he says, dissimulate the movement of charity behind which stands the Son of Man. So that's my translation, but the idea is, you know, Jesus is in and behind others. You know, we liberate Christ in the encounter with the other, and we are impeded from embracing that to the extent that we define ourselves by our abstract relationships. But actually, he's not calling on us to abandon our roles or our functions. I mean, one might say that the colleague or the associate and the neighbor are not antithetical, but they're two dimensions, if you like, of the same story. So our relationship to our neighbor, of course, often passes through social institutions. But what is the key that unlocks what the Samaritan is able to do is charity, whether directly or indirectly. It is the service of the needs of the other that creates fraternity, and it is only the capacity to serve others that comes from the ability to transcend our functions and our roles. So the philosopher observes that it becomes easier to see each other as we truly are, beloved sons and daughters of a loving God, when we are struck by what Ricoeur calls failures of the social realm, such as wars or historical disasters, or one might add, a great pandemic like the one we have been living through. Only then, says Ricoeur, socially stripped, do we perceive the depth of human relationships. Now, I think this is quite easy for us to relate to. How many Zooms have you been on over the past year about the pandemic and the effect that it's had on society, the effect that it's had on our own vision of others and vision of society? So one of the things that we've realized, have we not, in this pandemic is that, you know, we're all in the same boat together, that there's a shared vulnerability, that we are dependent on each other, that we are dependent particularly on care workers and people that we have not perhaps, we don't, you know, who don't command a high price on the market, actually turn out to be of great value and so on. So these crises, these calamities which beset humanity actually facilitate or make easier the ability to transcend our social functions and to understand each other as sons and daughters of a loving God. So I think that there's an idea almost to stay with. You know, how has that pandemic helped me to transcend my role? I mean, of course, if you've lost your job, you might say, well, you know, it's been a lot easier to transcend my social role because I haven't got a job anymore. And obviously that's tragic. But the point is there a gift in there? Is there a grace in this calamity that facilitates fraternity? Now, that's really, in many ways, what Francis is getting at in Let Us Dream, in the book that we wrote and that came out last December. And I know I talked about the book in January, and I don't want to go back over it. But actually, the idea there of the Fratelli Tutti obviously was very much in the background of the book. And right there at the beginning, of the book, Francis in the prologue, talks indeed about the Good Samaritan. Well, it talks about exactly this, really. He says, in a crisis, our functionalism is shaken loose. So functionalism is really the same idea as the associate, right? And we have to revise and modify our roles and habits in order to emerge from the crisis as better people. A crisis always demands that our whole self be present. You can't retreat, pull back into old ways and roles. And then he says, think of the Samaritan. He stops, pulls up, acts, enters into the world of the wounded man, throws himself into the situation, into the other's suffering, and so creates a new future. To act in a Samaritan way in a crisis means letting myself be struck by what I see, struck, impacted, knowing that the suffering will change me. You know? We Christians talk about this as taking up and embracing the cross, confident that what will come is new life, gives us the courage to stop lamenting and move out and serve others, and so enable change, which will only come from compassion and service. Okay. So the invitation of the crisis is to learn from the Good Samaritan, not to withdraw into ourselves, but rather to be called out of ourselves in the service of the other, the needy other. And that is what creates a new future. That is what enables a new kind of fraternity. So those are my thoughts on on Fratelli Tutti. And I just want to sort of end really with just taking this idea now of fraternity and culture of encounter, and with just a word about synodality, because this is a key word for Francis, a key concept again of his pontificate. We're living through something of what I might call a springtime of synodality, but like particularly of the spring we've just had, there are not a few frosts and cold winds that come with it. In other words, it's been quite a turbulent process. It's not necessarily been an easy one, but nonetheless absolutely fundamental. That what Francis is seeking to do in his pontificate in respect of the church is to help create some of the mechanisms and the culture which enable the culture of encounter, which enable dialogue, which enable us to overcome our polarizations, which we, of course, live with in a very real way in the church, and to provide mechanisms by which we can open ourselves to the Holy Spirit. So you may or may not know, we've got synods going on, at a national level in Australia. There's one in Germany, which is technically not a synod. The Irish bishops have just announced that they want to one. Francis has been urging the Italian bishops to have one. The Latin American bishops are getting back together in a synodal process this November. So it's kind of all happening at the moment, inspired by Francis's call for the church to be synodal. And at the heart of synodality is learning to, synodos means to walk together along the way. It's a very simple idea, but the key idea of synodality is to hold together our different views in tension, to hold them together without trying to resolve them, without trying to engage in this game of who's right and who's wrong. I've got my convictions, you've got yours. Let's see who wins. No, I've got my convictions, I've got yours, and I enter into a relationship with you, and I listen to you, and I walk with you, and I try to understand you, and I renounce to some extent my desire to be right or to prove myself, and I actually want to understand you. And in that whole process, what I'm doing is opening myself, or us rather, then to the action of the Holy Spirit. Now, Francis has spent some time, including in Let Us Dream, explaining what it means to be synodal and what a synod really is, how it's different from a parliamentary process, which is ultimately a competition between two sides, a debate in which one side wins out, there's a vote taken, and so on. Even though, of course, a synod has many elements, there's nothing wrong with parliamentary processes or debates in which we explore ideas and we look at what things for, things against. That's all perfectly good. But at the end of the day, we can't simply have a competition, because what we're doing in a synodal process is allowing something new to emerge, as it were, from the outside. So embracing synodality is a means of holding together our tensions while listening to the Spirit And at the same time, because this is a spiritual process, being conscious of those things which are preventing us from being open to grace. That's to say, our attachments, things that we're very attached to, our ideologies. I mean, as long as we see ourselves as entering into a forum of competing notions and debating ideas, then we can't discern. We create no room for the Spirit. And that's why Francis has constantly been saying throughout his pontificate at the beginning of synods, let's not drive the Holy Spirit from the hall. What the synod is about is the Holy Spirit. Synodality always presupposes and requires the eruption of the Holy Spirit. So just to end really on this note, that this paragraph in livestream, I think Francis spells out with enormous clarity, greatest clarity I think he's yet done on this subject, what it means to be a church which holds in tension contrary views in expectation of a resolution by overflow. That is to say, transcending differences through meetings of minds on a new plane. Here's a quote. At such moments, he says, the solution to an intractable problem comes in ways that are unexpected and unforeseen, the result of a new and greater creativity released, as it were, from the outside. That is what I mean by overflow, because it breaks the banks that confined our thinking and causes to pour forth, as if from an overflowing fountain, the answers that formerly the contraposition didn't let us see. We recognize this process as a gift from God because it is the same action of the Spirit described in Scripture and evident in history. Such overflows happen, above all, at the crossroads of life, at moments of openness, of fragility and of humility, when the ocean of his love bursts the dams of our self-sufficiency and so allows for a new imagination of the possible. So that for Francis, fraternity, synodality, the creation of a culture of encounter is all about ultimately opening ourselves to the action of the Spirit and allowing that new thing to appear beneath us. And it requires that capacity to step outside our roles, to take that risk, to be able to go out and to offer ourselves in dialogue and in listening to others, and so create that fraternity for which we all so long. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Austen. That was a tour de force and showed us the extraordinary breadth of vision of Francis and the wonderful challenge which he's bringing to the church. We did have a few questions, so if you're able to continue now, I'll just give you some of those. One person said that encounter requires a preparedness to participate. And there are some who attend encounters, and he mentions the Amazon Synod, with an agenda to thwart. So what is your view on this, particularly in regard to the Curia and the need to open the Catholic Church to radical and much needed change? And how do you think Francis is going to take this forward with this problem?
Yeah, well, I think it's a great question. I think Francis's own discernment of what took place at the synods is one of the most interesting things in Let Us Dream. And if you haven't read it, I urge you to read it, because one of the things he runs up against is you've mentioned the people who come to the synods, well, actually not so much necessarily inside the synod, but around it, with these agendas and fears and hysteria and accusations of capitulation to modernity, all this nonsense. But that's one threat. But there's another threat too, from a certain kind of progressive Catholic who says, well, the synod is clearly all about changing the way the church does, introducing ordination of married men, and these changes for which we progressives have all been longing. And Francis is quite open to having those discussed, as we know from the Amazonia Synod. But he won't advance until he sees that overflow, as he calls it, that presence of the Spirit, right? And that's what he describes in Let Us Spirit. He's quite critical of those people who say that, oh, Francis didn't, didn't implement the majority vote in favor of the ordination of married men because he was wanted to keep the church together, or he faced opposition from the Curia. No. If Francis senses that the Spirit is there saying then he will do it, and he almost won't care. But if that isn't there, then he won't feel free to do that. It's a very, very, synodality isn't is also about how the Pope governs the church. The Pope governs the church with the Holy Spirit in charge. And in a way, the Pope limits himself, his own power, to discerning and understanding what the Spirit is calling for. That's why this synodal process is so important, because it must allow for that presence of the Holy Spirit. And that's why it's so hard to have a genuinely synodal process if we come at it as a power game with our ideologies or with expectations, which then lead us to be disappointed if we don't get what we came for. And so it requires an attitude of humility and openness. And that's really what Francis is calling us to embrace.
Right, thank you. A couple of questions I'll put together. It's heartening to see how the Aparecida event was a Pentecostal moment for the church in Latin America. How is it that we don't seem to have had such a moment in our Catholic Church? Are we still buried in the hurt and fear of the Reformation? And if I link to that, another question, what evidence have you seen of the culture of encounter being put into practice by the hierarchy in the UK?
I have to think about the second one. First one, I think, I mean, it was Cardinal Martini in a famous posthumous interview in 2012, who spoke about the fire of the church in Europe and America having gone out, you know, that the church had grown cold. And he likened it to these embers that were burning, but they were under so many layers of ash that they weren't alight. And he had various reasons or diagnoses behind this. And if your question is why, then I think the answer is in the spiritual exercise of St. Ignatius, which is the clinging to attachments. So the clinging to power, to privilege, clinging to spaces of privilege. And my own diagnosis or my own analysis in my books is that both in Europe and America, secularization has been lived as a profound threat. In other words, it's seen as we're losing, we're having things taken away from us, rather than seeing it as I think Latin America or in developing countries understand it, which is to say, actually, the freedom from the secularization brings you to offer the encounter with Christ in much greater freedom. So I think that's one reason. I mean, what happened in 2013 was that the center of gravity of the church shifted from Europe to Latin America. Latin America is now the source church. And I think it's the source church because of that openness to the Holy Spirit at Aparecida, which enabled that Pentecost moment. Sorry, not Pentecostal, but Pentecost moment. Now you might say, well, why hasn't Europe and America lived it? Well, actually, they are living it because they've got Francis as Pope. Francis has brought that flame with him. He is, the southern wind has brought him to Rome. And Latin America is now the source of the church. Just as Spain and Italy were back in the 16th century, or you had, Middle Eastern countries at the beginning of the church. I mean, this is part of history. There's going to be the spirit moves. Right now and so we are being called to a conversion in the church in Europe and in America, and that of course is why this papacy has been very turbulent. This pontificate, I should say, has been turbulent because it's deeply threatening to a lot of people who have a lot of vested interests in clinging to power structures and institutional privileges and so on. So that's my brief answer. How have the bishops of this country implemented the culture of encounter? Do you know, I think I'm going to have to go away and just think about that one. Obviously, so much of their own witness, the way they act collegially and so on, is in itself, I think, synodal and exemplifies that culture. But certainly we need in this country far more synodality, and I'm hearing from the bishops a willingness to embrace this, and so that's really quite exciting, because it's only when the church can be synodal that we can help society become fraternal. That's a good catchphrase.
Right, okay. And perhaps a final question, how would you see the future of the Francis pontificate panning out, and the culture of encounter being developed in perhaps further ways?
Well, I've tried to make it a business not to second guess what's going to happen in this pontificate, because Francis loves to keep us guessing. I see, I mean, as he said, these are about the meeting with Al Sistani and so on. These are steps towards, on a road to build fraternity, and I think they're going to carry on. I think it's in Francis's instinct to carry on. He's naturally, as I explained, from childhood, wanted to build this culture of encounter wherever he goes, and he has now a great mission as the world's bridge builder. I think you're seeing it actually put into effect right now in preparation for Glasgow COP26, the climate change conference later this year. Francis, I believe, is already meeting. I think he's having a meeting today or tomorrow with Kerry from the United States. Francis is working very, very hard behind the scenes to build that culture, to build that fraternity among those people who are going to be involved in making big decisions about climate. He never stops building those bridges. In that sense, he lives and breathes the culture of encounter, and is putting it into place. I don't know what trips we're going to get. Iraq was a big surprise. I don't think anything else yet has been confirmed for this year. We're all now coming out of COVID, and things are very uncertain in terms of papal trips. But whether Francis is on board a plane, going to a foreign place, or sitting in the Santa Marta with the telephone in his hand, you can be sure he's building the culture of encounter.
Well, thank you so much, Austen. Thank you for the questions which came in, and to everybody for listening and watching. As you know, this event will be uploaded within the next couple of days. I think I'm told Monday. You'll be able to access it on whatgoodnews.org. And I think whether we've been here today, as it were, or not, I think we probably all want to listen again. I certainly do. And I think the way, Austen, you've brought everything together from the papacy and in the church and in the world has been really stimulating and helpful. So I do hope there will be a third presentation from you in the not too distant future. But thank you so much. I thank also
thank you.
I thank Paul Samuels and all the others who've helped put this together. Above all, thank you for all of you for supporting this event. God bless, and let's take it forward in the steps of Jesus, in the steps of Francis. Thank you very much.